Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott. Just yesterday, I had to send back the new Sony 85mm F1.4 G Master Mark II, but before I sent it back, I spent some time comparing it directly to the Sigma 85mm F1.4 DN lens, a lens that I happen to own, and so I had on hand to do that comparison with. And so today's video is going to be breaking down in some detail the similarities and the differences between these two lenses as what I would consider to be probably the top two competitors for an 85mm f1.4 in this space on Sony E-mount. Now actually this is the second time that I've compared the Sigma 85mm f1.4 DN to a Sony 85mm f1.4 G Master, because I actually did a comparison with the first GM lens in a video. You could check that out here if you'd like to take a look at that. But in this case, I'm going to hit the highlights, and then at the end I'll do a deep dive in a breakdown of the optical performance between these two lenses, because it is a little bit nuanced, the strengths and weaknesses relative to each other, but we'll do that at the end of the video. So before I give you some reasons to choose either Sigma or reasons to choose the Sony G Master Mark II lens, I'm going to first give you a look at some of the basic similarities. Both of these lenses are premium 85mm f1.4 lenses, and so that means that they have a very similar feature set. They have a lot of options when it comes to the aperture, the ability to either have a clicked aperture on the aperture ring to declick that for doing racking. There's an iris lock to engage to keep you either in or out of the manual aperture ring. They both have AF/MF switch. They both have a custom or function button, at least one on them, though one of them has two of them. Both of them have thorough weather sealing that starts with a gasket at the rear mount, a coating on the front element, and internal seals. Both of them have a 77mm front filter thread. Both of them have a premium build quality, and both of them come with an included lens hood and then also a protective case. And so there are a lot of similarities in the actual package that you get for your money. But there are also some places where the two lenses diverge from each other. So let's talk first about the Sigma lens, which is the older at this point. It was released in 2020, so it is nearly a four-year-old lens at this point. And so let's see how it compares to the more recent G Master. So the big reason to choose the Sigma, probably the most compelling reason, truth be told, is going to be price. Right now, it's currently available at B&H Photo for $1,070 US. The normal price is right under $1,200, but it is discounted, which is obviously much more likely to happen with a lens that's been on the market for a while. So right now, $1,070 versus the MSRP of the GM Mark II at right around $1,800 US. So that's a significant price difference. In fact, it is a difference, there's over 50% between the two that is there. Now the Sigma is also smaller. Now this is a less dramatic difference. The Sigma is 2mm narrower, but it is a full 11mm shorter, and thus as a byproduct it is also lighter. It is 17 grams lighter, and thus if your goal is to get a premium 85mm lens but to be as small and light as possible, Sigma is still the winner in that metric. The Sigma, as we're going to see in our breakdown, does have slightly softer bokeh. There's a little bit less edging. It's a little bit creamier and smoother, as we'll see in our optical breakdown. And also, though on paper they have similar specifications, the Sigma actually has a slightly better level of magnification between these two. And so that is another area of strength for the Sigma relative to the Sony G Master Mark II. However, there are some compelling reasons to consider the G Master lens as well. It has slightly more features. Now this is not significant, but it does have an extra focus hold or function button, so if you're shooting in a vertical or portrait orientation, you do have a handy button there. So that might be an issue for you depending on your actual shooting style. It definitely has the more premium autofocus setup of the two lenses. It is faster, it is more confident, and in fact, let's just pause here for a moment and let's look at a comparison between the two lenses. First of all, in just their autofocus test here. Now you can see from those tests that clearly there is an advantage for both confidence and speed when it comes to the G Master lens. Also, if you take a look at their video capabilities, you can see in this comparison test just how much more confident that the G Master is than the Sigma lens. So obviously that is going to be a pretty compelling factor. The Sony is designed with the most recent A9 Mark III in mind and its ability to shoot up to 120 frames per second. So it's going to provide extremely rapid autofocus, and what I found is that even in very high demanding autofocus situations, I was able to shoot with the G Master lens on my Alpha 1 or my A7R Mark V with great confidence in places that the Sigma can't quite match. For ordinary things, Sigma is just fine, and I've never had any issues with it over the nearly 4 years of ownership at this point. But if you're wanting to shoot at the margins, sports, or things like that, high-speed action, then definitely the G Master is the winner there. It also exhibits lower focus breathing, and you probably already saw that in the tests we've looked at. I saw it both for when testing for stills, going from a further to a distant subject, but then also in video focus pools, that it has lower natural focus breathing, and also as a first-party lens, what little bit of focus breathing there can be offset by focus breathing compensation if you have a camera that's so equipped. It also has considerably less distortion. The Sigma's biggest optical weakness is that it has rather pronounced pincushion distortion that you can definitely see in certain images. Now obviously a profile cleans it up fine, but it's certainly there. There's also significantly less vignette on the new GM lens, which is remarkably low for f1.4 lens. So definitely a win there. I also, as you'll see in the optical breakdown, the Sony GM Mark II is an exceptionally good lens at having micro contrast and the ability thus to render very fine details. And it's exceptionally good even at f1.4 in a way that I've rarely seen. It may be one of the best lenses that I've ever seen for its ability to render fine details. And I found that to be true both at close focus distances and even all the way out to infinity, where it really impressed me in that regard. So definitely some areas of strength. My conclusion is this: the Sony GM Mark II has two definite areas of strength relative to the Sigma lens. It has better autofocus, demonstrably better autofocus, and it has better micro contrast and the ability to render very fine details. It is probably the most exceptional 85mm lens that I have seen in that regard. But I guess the question is this: is those two advantages enough to offset an over 50% price difference between the two lenses? In fact, the Sony is 68% more expensive than what the Sigma lens is. So I think the answer to that question depends on your actual needs as a photographer. Do you actually stray into the areas where you need that faster autofocus, or in certain situations where you need that ability to really render very fine details in a superior way to what the Sigma offers? And if that does apply to you, then the answer is probably yes, it's worth the additional money. If the answer to that question is no, or more of a maybe, well, your decision gets a whole lot more complicated. Let's see if the deep dive optical breakdown can help to simplify that decision for you as we take a deeper look at that. And if you don't want to do that, I also have linked in the description down below my reviews for both of those lenses, and you can check them out individually if you prefer. But if you want to see the deep dive into the optics and how they compare head to head in a variety of situations, let's dive into that together. So the comparisons will always feature the Sigma on the left hand and the GM on the right hand. And we'll start here by taking a look at vignette and distortion. You can see that both of these metrics really strongly favor the G Master lens here on the right. The Sigma lens has a significant amount of pincushion distortion, about a -10 to correct compared to about a -2 to correct here. Likewise, the vignette approaches about +70 to correct for it, whereas I only needed a +30 to correct for that on the actual GM lens. Now here's a real-world shot that will show you where you're going to see that. You can see here on the left side with the Sigma lens that as long as you're close to the center of the frame, it's fairly neutral, but as you get towards the edges, you really start to see that pincushion distortion in a strong way. Whereas the GMs, while there is a tiny bit of pincushion distortion, it is so minimal that in a shot like this, frankly, you're just not going to see it, both of these being uncorrected. Now, neither one of these lenses really has an issue when it comes to longitudinal chromatic aberrations. So you can see here on the left with the Sigma, very, very little fringing before or after the plane of focus, and then the GM is, if anything, even very slightly better, though frankly, they are close enough that you're not going to really see any kind of difference in the real world. Case in point, here you can see if we pop into the actual textures here that both of these lenses are doing a really fantastic job of controlling the fringing as we head towards defocus. You can see that there just really isn't much to see in terms of fringing from either one of these lenses, both of them doing a really fantastic job in controlling that. Both of these lenses claim a similar level of magnification, but what I am finding here is that I actually think that the Sony lens is underperforming its measurement a little bit. And so, for example, if we pop in here and we take a look at the level of magnification, I think you can see that it's actually a little bit higher on the Sigma, even though they're rated for the same. You can definitely see that the 1963 here, for example, is larger than what it is for the GM lens. And so definitely a bit of an underperforming on the amount of magnification. In terms of the up-close performance, they are similar. I'm going to give a very, very slight edge in contrast to the GM lens, but as you can see, it is somewhat dependent on where you look in the frame. Both of them have a nicely flat plane of focus, though you can clearly see that the GM does a better job, and part of that has to do with the Sigma's amount of distortion that has to be corrected there in the corners, whereas the GM lens does not. Overall, both of them are nice and strong lenses, but up-close performance, I'm going to say, is a little bit sharper for the GM. Now this brings us to the main event that a lot of people are looking at, and that is resolution and contrast. These comparisons are being done on a 61 megapixel A7R Mark V, and results here are going to be shown at 200% magnification. Now, if we look at the center of the frame, both of these lenses are really, really sharp. As you can see, both deliver very high degrees of contrast and detail. What you can see is that there's just a little bit more contrast, a little more difference between the shadow and the bright area on the GM lens as compared to the Sigma lens. You can see that as we look over here in the mid-frame result. I want you to take a look inside this 5. You can see on the GM how much of the textures are shown clearly there. They're just a little bit muddier on the Sigma lens. Again, both lenses are great, but the GM is clearly better. And down into the corner, one caveat here, the Sigma is going to look brighter because it does have its profile. It needs that correction. I haven't even messed with the GM correcting it because it really has a fairly low amount of vignette naturally. But if we're looking at the textures rather than just the exposure here, you can see that they did expose equally under similar lighting conditions. But you can see that the textures here in this building are much more clearly defined than what they are here and on the Sigma lens. On the other side of the frame, just to check centering, you can see that both lenses are consistent, but the GM is consistently better. Look in the hair here in particular, how much different that is. If we pop up here to the mid-frame on this side, again, you can just see more sharpness and detail contrast for the GM lens. And up into the left corner here, again, it's not that the Sigma looks bad, but the GM clearly looks better. If we stop both lenses down to f2, both of them are incredibly sharp in the center of the frame. No issue with that here. You can see both of them are delivering high levels of detail and contrast. You're going to be perfectly delighted with either lens, but I do think that there's still a bit of an advantage in that micro contrast for the GM lens that just delivers a little bit better results. And definitely into the corner here, while again, the Sigma is good, the GM lens is great. Now by f5.6, we are hitting what is typically around the peak performance for consistency across the frame, kind of a landscape aperture for these lenses. And I would say that the same advantages are present, where the contrast and micro contrast does favor the G Master lens. Both lenses look great, but one clearly looks better. Likewise here, that, in the textures here, they're just still clear and brighter, better rendered on the GM versus the Sigma on the left side, and down right into the corners, we can see again that detail just remains the same. If we look up here in these forever stamps here, you can just see again, contrast looks a little bit better on the GM lens. As we pan across here, you can see as we get towards the center of the frame, the difference is less pronounced. But as we move across here, we can see that the GM lens just retains a little bit more detail and a little bit better performance as we go all across the frame to the left side here. Now, diffraction is going to affect both of these lenses, obviously. Both of them have a minimum aperture of f16. You can see that diffraction has softened the textures on both of them considerably, but what you can also see is that the basic contrast and micro contrast is still better on the GM than what it is on the Sigma lens. But of course, sharpness isn't everything. And so as we take a look here at this image, first of all, we can pop into the subject and you can see that both of them look very sharp in this real world setting. But there's just more nuance in the delivery from the G Master lens. However, when you look at the out of focus area, you can see that there is definitely more outlining. The background is just a little bit more obvious. If you look at this out of focus fence here, it is just more softly rendered on the Sigma lens than what it is on the G Master lens. It's not major, as you can see, but it is noticeable. I would say it's a little bit more obvious in this image. And so we have a more complex background here. And what you can see as you look at that background is that the Sigma looks very slightly softer when you're looking at some of these. And if we punch in, you can see that there's just a little bit more definition, a little bit more edging on some of these things for the GM lens. And you can also see that the specular highlights are a little bit smaller and they're a little brighter and softer on the Sigma lens, and so that gives it an advantage in the rendering in some of these areas. This particular image, however, really shows off the difference in the micro contrast between the two lenses. You can see that the Sigma looks good, but the GM lens looks great, like amazingly great. Macro levels of defining all of those very small textures, and that really to me was the standout in the optical performance for the GM lens, is its ability to render very fine details, which the Sigma does well, but the GM does exceptionally well. If we take a look down here, this is an area where definitely there could be fringing. Neither image has any kind of issue with fringing, but the GM lens, once again, it just handles those very fine textures better than what the Sigma lens does. If we look at one other thing, however, and that's this specular highlight right here. And you could look at any of the others, but you can see looking at it that the overall rendering is just a little bit softer on the Sigma and a little bit more defined on the GM lens. And I think that's the give and take, the tension between the two, that the background defocus is a little softer on the Sigma, whereas it's just very slightly harsher on the GM lens. Taking a look at this image here, we can see those similar truths about the overall kind of micro contrast. Both of them, again, look great. The GM looks just a little bit better. And as we look towards these defocused areas, you can just see there's a little bit more complexity in the GM rendering, whereas the Sigma rendering is just a little softer overall. And so there, in a nutshell, you have some of the give and take, the tension between the optical performance of these two lenses.
So hopefully the optical deep dive has helped to clear up any further questions you might have had and the difference between the optical performance between the two and which of these that you like better, or whether or not you can say, well, the Sigma is close enough that for the price, I think I'll take it. Either way, I hope that this information has equipped you to make a more informed buying decision. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day and let the light in.